Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. Don't forget to support me on local Subscribestar, buy me a coffee, and check out my essays on Substack. Today will be the first in a series of readings of Sutton's Wall Street Trilogy and The Best Enemies That Money Can Buy. So this will be one for the long haul, guys. But Sutton is such an important figure that it's definitely worth to do so. And I initially started thinking about this given the relative success of my reading of the scholarly reviews of his more academic research with the scholarly trilogy on the Soviet technical transfers to the Soviet Union. And I thought, well, that's very meaty and technical. I don't think a lot of people are going to enjoy that. But his more casual orientation with the Wall Street Trilogy seems to be something that a lot of people could enjoy, and they definitely were interested in it when I wrapped up my series on Wall Street and the Scholars, or Sutton and the Scholars. Now, not yet. There should at some point be a bonus episode where some of those articles that were in foreign languages, said I have a friend who can translate them, will be done. So when that's done, you can expect a small break in this series with a bonus episode of Sutton and the Scholars. We see we have GF and Cyber Ninja Zero in the chat, as well as Tricky Woo. So hello, everyone. Okay, we are going to start Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Antony C. Sutton. So let's just briefly look at the contents here so people sort of get a basic idea of what we're going to cover. Feel free to pause. Okay. 2. These unknown Russian libertarians, also known as the Greens, who in 1919 fought both the Reds and the Whites in their attempt to gain a free and voluntary Russia. Preface. Since the early 1920s, numerous pamphlets and articles and even a few books have sought to forge a link between international bankers and Bolshevik revolutionaries. Rarely have these attempts been supported by hard evidence, and neither have such attempts been argued within the framework of a scientific methodology. Indeed, some of the evidence used in these efforts has been fraudulent, some has been irrelevant, much cannot be checked. Examination of the topic by academic writers has been studiously avoided, probably because the hypothesis offends the neat dichotomy of capitalists versus communists, and everyone knows, of course, that these are bitter enemies. Moreover, because a great deal that has been written border on the absurd, a sound academic reputation could easily be wrecked on the shoals of ridicule. Reason enough to avoid the topic. Fortunately, the State Department file, particularly the 861.00 section, contains extensive documentation on the hypothesized link. What the evidence in these official papers is merged with non-official evidence from biographies, personal papers, and conventional histories, a truly fascinating story emerges. We find there was a link between some New York international bankers and many revolutionaries, including Bolsheviks. These banking gentlemen who are here identified had a financial stake in and were rooting for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. Who, why, and for how much is the story in this book. Antony Sutton, March 1974. Chapter 1, The Actors on the Revolutionary Stage. Dear Mr. President, I am in sympathy with the Soviet form of government as that best suited for the Russian people. Letter to Woodrow Wilson, October 17, 1918, from William Lawrence Saunders, Chairman, Ingersoll Rand Corp. Director, American International Corps and Deputy Chairman, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The front piece in this book was drawn by cartoonist Robert Miner in 1911 for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Miner was a talented artist and a writer who doubled as a Bolshevik revolutionary, got himself arrested in Russia in 1915 for alleged subversion, and was later bankrolled by prominent Wall Street financiers. Miner's cartoon portrays a bearded, beaming Karl Marx in the Wall Street with socialism tucked under his arm and accepting the congratulations of financial luminaries J.P. Morgan partner George W. Perkins, a smug John D. Rockefeller, John D. Ryan of National City Bank, and Teddy Roosevelt, prominently identified by his famous teeth in the background. Wall Street is decorated by red flags. The cheering crowd and the airborne hat suggest that Karl Marx must have been a fairly popular sort of fellow in the New York financial district. Was Robert Miner dreaming? On the contrary, we see that Miner was on firm ground in depicting an enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism. The characters in Miner's cartoon, Karl Marx, symbolizing the future revolutionaries Lenin and Trotsky, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and indeed Robert Miner himself, are also prominent characters in this book. The contradictions suggested by Miner's cartoon have been brushed under the rug of history because they do not fit the accepted conceptual spectrum of political left and political right. Bolsheviks are at the left of the political spectrum and Wall Street financiers are at the right. Therefore, we implicitly reason the two groups have nothing in common, and any alliance between the two is absurd. Factors contrary to this neat conceptual arrangement are usually rejected as bizarre observations or unfortunate errors. Modern history possesses such a built-in duality, and certainly if too many uncomfortable facts have been rejected and brushed under the rug, it is an inaccurate history. I'll just add briefly in here, given that Germany and the Soviet Union were allies briefly during World War II, one representing the theoretical right and the other the left, it shouldn't be in principle surprising. We've already seen actual historical evidence with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But for whatever reasons, and reasons that Sutton will get into, it is inconceivable. And I remember when it was inconceivable for me, that is until I read Sutton. On the other hand, it may be observed that both the extreme right and the extreme left of the conventional political spectrum are absolutely collectivist. The National Socialists, for example, the fascists, and the International Socialists, for example, the communists, both recommend totalitarian politico-economic systems based on naked, unfettered political power and individual coercion. Both systems require monopoly control of society. While monopoly control of industries was once the objective of J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller, by the late 19th century, the inner sanctums of Wall Street understood that the most efficient way to gain an unchallenged monopoly was to go political, and to make society to go to work for the monopolists under the name of the public good and public interest. This strategy was detailed in the 1906 by Frederick C. Howe in his Confessions of a Monopolist. Howe, by the way, is also a figure in the story of the Bolshevik Revolution. Again, minor point, I read Confessions of a Monopolist, at least parts of it. Very interesting. Therefore, an alternative conceptual packaging of political ideas and politico-economic systems would be that of ranking the degree of individual freedom versus the degree of centralized political control. Under such an ordering, the corporate welfare state and socialism are at the same end of the spectrum. Hence, we see the attempts at monopoly control of society can have different labels while owning common features. Consequently, one barrier to mature understanding of recent history is the notion that all capitalists are the bitter and unswerving enemies of all Marxists and socialists. This erroneous idea originated with Karl Marx and was undoubtedly useful to his purposes. In fact, the idea is nonsense. There has been continuing, albeit concealed, alliance between international political capitalists and international revolutionary socialists to their mutual benefit. This alliance has gone unobserved largely because historians, with a few notable exceptions, have an unconscious Marxian bias and are thus locked into the impossibility of any such alliance existing. The open-minded reader should bear two clues in mind. Monopoly capitalists are the bitter enemies of laissez-faire entrepreneurs, and given the weakness of the socialist central planning, the totalitarian socialist state is a perfect captive market for monopoly capitalists, if an alliance can be made with the socialist power brokers. Suppose, and it is only the hypothesis at this point, that American monopoly capitalists were able to reduce a planned socialist Russia to the status of a captive technical colony. Would not this be the illogical 20th century's international extension of the Morgan Railroad monopolies and the Rockefeller Petroleum Trust of the late 19th century? Apart from Gabriel Coco, Murray Rothbard, and the revisionists, historians have not been alert for such a combination of events. Historical reporting, with rare exceptions, has been forced into a dichotomy of capitalists versus socialists. George Kennan's monumental and readable study of the Russian Revolution consistently maintains the fiction of a Wall Street Bolshevik dichotomy. Russia leaves the war has a single incidental reference to the J.P. Morgan firm and no reference at all to Guarantee Trust Company. Yet both organizations are prominently mentioned in the State Department files, to which frequent reference is made in this book, and both are part of the core of the evidence presented here. Neither self-admitted Bolshevik banker Olaf Oxberg nor Niam Bonken in Stockholm is mentioned in Kennan, yet both were central to Bolshevik funding. Moreover, in minor yet crucial circumstances, at least crucial for our argument, Kennan is factually in error. For example, Kennan cites Federal Reserve Bank Director William Boyce Thompson as leaving Russia on November the 27th, 1917. This departure date would make it physically impossible for Thompson to be in Petrograd on December the 2nd, 1917, to transmit a cable request for $1 million to Morgan in New York. Thompson, in fact, left Petrograd on December the 4th, 1918, 2 days after sending the cable to New York. Then again, Kennan states that on November the 30th, 1917, Trotsky delivered a speech before the Petrograd Soviet in which he observed, "Today I am here in the Samoyny Institute, two Americans closely connected with the American capitalist elements." According to Kennan, it is difficult to imagine who these two Americans could have been, if not Robbins and Gumberg. But in fact, Alexander Gumberg was Russian, not American. Further, as Thompson was still in Russia on November the 30th, 1917, then the two Americans who visited Trotsky were more likely Raymond Robbins, a mining promoter turned do-gooder, and Thompson of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Bolshevization of Wall Street was known among well-informed circles as early as 1919. The financial journalist Barron recorded a conversation with oil magnate E.H. Doheny in 1919 and specifically named three prominent financiers, William Boyce Thompson, Thomas Lamont, and Charles R. Kane, aboard SS Aquitania, Friday evening, February the 1st, 1919. Spent the evening with Doheny's in their suite. Mr. Doheny said, "If you believe in democracy, you cannot believe in socialism. Socialism is the poison that destroys democracy. Democracy means opportunity for all. Socialism holds out the hope that a man can quit work and be better off. Bolshevism is the true fruit of socialism, and if you will read the interesting testimony before the Senate committee about the middle of January that showed up all these pacifists and peacemakers as German sympathizers, socialists and Bolsheviks, you will see that a majority of college professors in the United States are teaching socialism and Bolshevism, and that 52 college professors were on so-called peace committees in 1914. President Eliot of Harvard is teaching Bolshevism. The worst Bolshevists in the United States are not only college professors, of whom President Wilson is one, but capitalists and their wives of capitalists, and neither seem to know what they are talking about. William Boyce Thompson is teaching Bolshevism, and he may yet convert Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company. Vanderlip is a Bolshevist, so is Charles R. Crane. Many women are joining the movement, and neither they nor their husbands know what it is or what it leads to. Henry Ford is another, and so are most of those 100 historians Wilson took aboard with him in the foolish idea that history can teach youth proper demarcations of races, peoples, and nations' geography. In belief, this story of the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath, but a story that departs from the usual conceptual straitjacket approach of capitalists versus communists. Our story postulates a partnership between international monopoly capitalism and international revolutionary socialism for their mutual benefit. The final human cost of this alliance has fallen upon the shoulders of the individual Russian and individual American. Entrepreneurship has been brought into disrepute, and the world has been propelled towards inefficient socialist planning as a result of these monopoly maneuverings in the world of politics and revolution. This is also a story reflecting the betrayal of the Russian Revolution. The czars and their corrupt political system were ejected only to be replaced by the new power brokers of another corrupt political system. Where the United States could have exerted its dominant influence to bring about a free Russia, it truckled to the ambitions of a few Wall Street financiers who, for their own purposes, could accept a centralized czarist Russia or a centralized Marxist Russia, but not a decentralized free Russia. And the reasons for these assertions will unfold as we develop the underlying and so far untold history of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. Footnotes, Chapter 1. Chapter 1. These are the rules of big business. They have been superseded. The teachings of our parents and are reducible to a simple maxim: get a monopoly, let society work for you, and remember that all of the businesses is politics. For a legislative grant, franchise, subsidy, or tax exemption is worth more than a Kimberly or Comstock load, since it does not require any labor, either mental or physical, lot its exploitation. So that was from Confessions of Monopolists. Let's see. 4 is interesting. There is a parallel and also unknown history with respect to the Makhnovite movement that fought both the whites and the reds in the Civil War. See Volin, The Unknown Revolution. There was also the Green movement, which fought both whites and reds. The author has never seen even one isolated mention of Greens in any history of the Bolshevik Revolution, yet the Green Army was at least 700,000 strong. So, yeah, just as a summary for chapter 1, what Sutton is saying is that there are international monopoly capitalists who want captive markets and don't want and seek state alliances and state privileges in order to get them. And the Bolsheviks, because they're socialists, don't have efficient planning and can't develop new technologies, are therefore dependent in a subservient role to these monopoly capitalists. And then he then pits them against this traditional idea of American entrepreneurship. Chapter 2. Trotsky leaves New York to complete the revolution. You will have a revolution, a terrible revolution. What course it takes will depend much on what Mr. Rockefeller tells Mr. Haig to do. Mr. Rockefeller is a symbol of the American ruling class, and Mr. Haig is a symbol of its political tools. Leon Trotsky in the New York Times, December 13th, 1938. Haig was a New Jersey politician. In 1916, the year preceding the Russian Revolution, internationalist Leon Trotsky was expelled from France, officially because of his participation in the Zimmerwald Conference, but also, no doubt, because of inflammatory articles written for Naše Slovo, a Russian-language newspaper printed in Paris. In September 1916, Trotsky was politely escorted across the Spanish border by French police. A few days later, Madrid police arrested the internationalist and lodged him in a first-class cell at a charge of 1.5 pistas per day. Subsequently, Trotsky was taken to Cadiz, then to Barcelona, finally to be placed on board the Spanish transatlantic company steamer Montserrat. Trotsky and family crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in New York on January the 13th, 1917. Other Trotskyites also made their way westward across the Atlantic Ocean. Indeed, one Trotskyite group acquired sufficient immediate influence in Mexico to write the Constitution of Querétaro for the revolutionary 1917 Carranza government, giving Mexico the dubious distinction of being the first government in the world to adopt a Soviet-style type constitution. How did Trotsky, who knew only German and Russian, survive in capitalist America? According to his autobiography, My Life, my only profession in New York was that of a revolutionary socialist. In other words, Trotsky wrote occasional articles for Novy Mir, the New York Russian Socialist Journal, yet we know that the Trotsky family apartment in New York had a refrigerator and a telephone, and according to Trotsky, that the family occasionally traveled in chauffeured limousine. This mode of living puzzled the two young Trotsky boys. When they went into a tea room, the boys would anxiously demand of their mother, "Why doesn't the chauffeur come in?" The stylish living standard is also at odds with Trotsky's reported income. The only funds that Trotsky admits receiving in 1916 and 1917 are $310. And said Trotsky, I distributed the 310 among 5 immigrants who were returning to Russia. Yet Trotsky had paid for a first-class cell in Spain. The Trotsky family had traveled across Europe to the United States. They had acquired an excellent apartment in New York, paying rent 3 months in advance, and they had used of a chauffeured limousine. All of this was on the earnings of an impoverished revolutionary for a few articles for the low-circulation Russian-language newspaper Naše Slovo in Paris and Novy Mir in New York. Joseph Nedava estimated Trotsky's 1917 income at $12 per week, supplemented by some lecture fees. Trotsky was in New York in 1917 for 3 months, from January to March, so that makes $144 income from Novy Mir, and say another $100 in lecture fees, for a total of $244. Of this $244, Trotsky was able to give away $310 to his friends, pay for the New York apartment, provide for his family, and find the $10,000 that was taken from him in April 1917 by Canadian authorities in Halifax. Trotsky claims that those who said he had other sources of income were slanderers, spreading stupid calumnies and lies. But unless Trotsky was playing the horses at the Jamaica racetrack, it can't be done. Obviously, Trotsky had unreported source of income. What was the source? In The Road to Safety, author Arthur Willert says Trotsky earned a living by working as an electrician for Fox Film Studios. Other writers have cited other occupations, but there is no evidence that Trotsky occupied himself for remuneration otherwise than by writing and speaking. Most investigation is centered on the verifiable fact that when Trotsky left New York in 1917 for Petrograd to organize the Bolshevik phase of the revolution, he left with $10,000. In 1919, the U.S. Senate Overman Committee investigating Bolshevik propaganda and German money in the United States and incidentally touched on the source of Trotsky's $10,000. Examination of Colonel Herbin, Washington attaché to the Czech Legion by the Overman Committee, yielded the following. Colonel Herbin, Trotsky perhaps took money from Germany, but Trotsky will deny it. Lenin will not deny it. Milyukov proved that he got 10,000 from some Germans while he was in America. Milyukov had the proof, but he denied it. Trotsky did, although Milyukov had the proof. Senator Overman, it was charged that Trotsky got 10,000 here. Colonel Herbman, I do not remember how much it was, but I know it was a question between him and Milyukov. Senator Overman, Milyukov proved it, did he? Colonel Herbman, yes, sir. Senator Overman, do you know where he got it from? Colonel Herbman, I remember it was 10,000, but it was no matter. I will speak about their propaganda. The German government knew Russia better than anybody, and they knew that with the help of these people, they could destroy the Russian army. At 5:45 p.m., the subcommittee adjourned until tomorrow, Wednesday, Friday the 19th at 10:30 a.m. It is quite remarkable that the committee adjourned abruptly before the source of Trotsky's funds could be placed into the Senate record. When questioning resumed the next day, Trotsky and his 10,000 were no longer of interest to the Overman Committee. We shall later develop evidence concerning the financing of German and revolutionary activities in the United States by New York financial houses. The origin of Trotsky's 10,000 will then come into focus. An amount of 10,000 of German origin is also mentioned in the official British telegram to Canadian naval authorities in Halifax, who requested that Trotsky and party en route to the revolution be taken off the SS Christianaford, who we also learned from a British Directorate of Intelligence report that Gregory Weinstein, who in 1919 was to become a prominent member of the Soviet Bureau in New York, collected funds for Trotsky in New York. These funds originated in Germany and were channeled through the Volkszeitung, a German daily newspaper in New York and subsidized by the German government. While Trotsky's funds are officially reported as German, Trotsky was actively engaged in American politics immediately prior to leaving New York for Russia and the revolution. On March 5th, 1917, American newspapers headlined the increasing plausibility of war with Germany. The same evening, Trotsky proposed a resolution at the meeting of the New York Country Socialist Party, pledging socialists to encourage strikes and resist recruiting in event of war with Germany. Leon Trotsky was called by the New York Times an exiled Russian revolutionist. Louis C. Freyana, who co-sponsored the Trotsky Resolution, later under an alias, wrote an uncritical book on the Morgan financial enterprise entitled House of Morgan. The Trotsky-Freyana proposal was opposed by Morris Hillquit faction, and the Socialist Party subsequently voted opposition to the resolution. More than a week later, on March 16th, at the time of the disposition of the Tsar, Leon Trotsky was interviewed in the offices of Novy Mir. The interview contained a prophetic statement on the Russian Revolution. The committee which has taken the place of the deposed ministry in Russia did not represent the interests or aims of the revolutionists, that it would probably be short-lived and step down in favor of men who would be more sure to carry forward the democratization of Russia. These men who would be more sure to carry forward the democratization of Russia, that is, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, were then in exile abroad and needed first to return to Russia. The temporary committee was therefore dubbed the Provisional Government, a title, it should be noted, that was used from the start of the revolution in March and not applied ex post facto by historians. Woodrow Wilson and a passport for Trotsky. President Woodrow Wilson was the fairy godmother who provided Trotsky with a passport to return to Russia to carry forward the revolution. This American passport was accompanied by a Russian entry permit and a British transit visa. Jennings C. Wise, and Woodrow Wilson, disciple of revolution, makes the pertinent comment, historians must never forget that Woodrow Wilson, despite the efforts of the British police, made it possible for Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport. President Wilson facilitated Trotsky's passage to Russia. At the same time, careful State Department bureaucrats concerned about such revolutionaries entering Russia were unilaterally attempting to tighten up passport procedures. The Stockholm litigation cabled the State Department on June 13, 1917, just after Trotsky crossed the Finnish-Russian border. Legation confidently informed Russian, English, and French passport offices at Russia frontier Tornia, considerably worried by passage of suspicious persons bearing American passports. To this cable, the State Department replied, on the same day, Department is exercising special care in insurance of passports for Russia. The department also authorized expenditures by the legation to establish a passport control office in Stockholm and to hire an absolutely dependable American citizen for employment on control work. But the bird had flown the coop. Menshevik Trotsky, with Lenin's Bolsheviks, was already in Russia preparing to carry forward the revolution. The passport net erected caught only more legitimate birds. For example, on June the 26th, 1917, Herman Bernstein, a reputable New York newspaperman on his way to Petrograd to represent the New York Herald, was held at the border and refused entry to Russia. Somewhat tardily, in mid-August 1917, the Russian embassy in Washington requested the State Department, and State agreed, to prevent the entry into Russia of criminals and anarchists, none of whom had already gone to Russia. Consequently, by virtue of the preferential treatment of Trotsky when the SS Christianoford left New York on March 26, 1917, Trotsky was aboard and holding a U.S. passport, and in company with other Trotskyite revolutionaries, Wall Street financiers, and American communists, and other interesting persons, few of whom had embarked for legitimate business. This mixed bag of passengers has been described by Lincoln Steffens, the American communist. The passenger list was long and mysterious. Trotsky was in the steerage with a group of revolutionaries. There was a Japanese revolutionist in my cabin. There were a lot of Dutch hurrying home from Java, the only innocent people aboard. The rest were war messengers, 2 from Wall Street to Germany. Notably, Lincoln Steffens was aboard en route to Russia at the specific invitation of Charles Richard Crane, a backer and former chairman of the Democratic Party's Financial Committee. Charles Crane, vice president of the Crane Company and organized the Westinghouse Company in Russia, was a member of the route mission to Russia and had made no fewer than 23 visits to Russia between 1890 and 1930. Richard Crane, his son, was confidential assistant to the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. According to the former ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, Crane did much to bring on the Kerensky Revolution, which gave way to communism. And so Steffens' comments in his diary about conversations aboard the SS Christianoford are highly pertinent. All agree that the revolution is in its first phase, only that it must grow. Crane and Russian radicals on the ship think we shall be in Petrograd for the re-revolution. Crane returned to the United States when the Bolshevik Revolution, that is, the re-revolution, had been completed, and although a private citizen was giving first-hand reports of the progress on the Bolshevik Revolution as cables were received at the State Department, for example, one memorandum dated December 11, 1917, is entitled Copy of a Report on Maximalist Uprising for Mr. Crane. It originated with Madden Summers, U.S. Consul General in Moscow, and the covering letter from Summers reads in part, I have the honor to enclose herewith a copy of same above report with the request that it be sent for the confidential information of Mr. Charles R. Crane. It is assumed that the department will have no objection to Mr. Crane seeing the report. In brief, the unlikely and puzzling picture that emerges is that Charles Crane, a friend and backer of Woodrow Wilson, and a prominent financier and politician, had a known role in the first revolution and traveled to Russia in mid-1917 in company with the American communist Lincoln Steffens, who was in touch with both Woodrow Wilson and Trotsky. The latter, in turn, was carrying a passport issued at the order of Woodrow Wilson and $10,000 from supposed German sources. On his return to the U.S. after the re-revolution, Crane was granted access to official documents concerning consolidation of the Bolshevik regime. This is a pattern of interlocking if puzzling events that warrants further investigation, suggests, though without at this point proving evidence, some link between the financier Crane and the revolutionary Trotsky. Canadian government documents on Trotsky's release. Documents on Trotsky's brief stay in Canada in Canadian custody are now declassified and available from the Canadian government archives. According to these archives, Trotsky was removed by Canadian and British naval personnel from the SS Christianoford at Halifax, Nova Scotia on April 3, 1917, listed as a German prisoner of war and interred at Amherst, Nova Scotia, internment station for German prisoners. Mrs. Trotsky, the 2 Trotsky boys, and 5 other men described as Russian socialists were also taken off and interned. Their names are recorded by the Canadian files as Nikita Muchin, Lyba Fishalev, Konstantin Romachenko, Grigor Tikhonadovsk, I can't do the others, Leon Bronstein Trotsky, all spellings from original Canadian documents. Canadian Army from LB1 under serial number 1098, including thumbprints, was completed for Trotsky with description as follows. 37 years old, a political exile, occupation journalist, born in Gromsky, Chusan, Russian citizen. The former was signed by Leon Trotsky and his full name given as Lev Bromstein, Sick Trotsky. The Trotsky Party was removed from the SS Christianiafjord under official instructions received by cablegram of March 29, 1917. London, presumably originating in the Admiralty with the naval control officer Halifax. The cablegram reported that Trotsky Party was on the Christianiafjord and should be taken off and retained pending instructions. The reason given to the naval control officer at Halifax was that these are Russian socialists leaving for purposes of starting a revolution against present Russian government, for which Trotsky is reported to have $10,000 subscribed by socialists and Germans. On April 1st, 1917, the naval control officer, Captain O.M. Mackens, sent a confidential memorandum to the general officer commanding at Halifax, to the effect that he had examined all Russian passengers aboard the SS Christianiafjord and found 6 men in the second-class section. They are all avowed socialists, and though professing a desire to help the new Russian government, might well be in league with the German socialists in America, and quite likely to be a great hindrance to the government in Russia just at present. Captain Mackens added that he was going to remove the group, as well as Trotsky's wife and 2 sons, in order to intern them at Halifax. A copy of this report was forwarded from Halifax to the Chief of the General Staff in Ottawa, April 2nd, 1917. The next document in the Canadian files is dated April 7th. From the Chief of the General Staff, Ottawa, to the Director of the Intermittent Operations, and acknowledges a previous letter not in the files about the internment of Russian socialists at Amherst, Nova Scotia. In this connection, have to inform you of the receipt of a long telegram yesterday from the Russian Consul General, Montreal, protesting against the arrest of these men as they were in possession of passports issued by the Russian Consul General, New York, USA. The reply to this Montreal telegram was to the effect that the men were interned on suspicion of being German and would be released only upon definite proof of their nationality and loyalty to the Allies. No telegram from the Russian Consul General in New York are in the Canadian files, and it is known that this office was reluctant to issue Russian passports to Russian political exiles. However, there is a telegram in the files from the New York Attorney General N. Alienkov to R.M. Kotler, then Deputy Postmaster General of Canada. The Postmaster General's office in Canada had no connection with either internment of prisoners of war or military activities. Accordingly, this telegram was in the nature of a personal, non-official intervention. It reads, Dr. R.M. Coulter, Postmaster General, Ottawa, Russian political exiles returning to Russia, detained Halifax interned Amherst camp. Kindly investigate and advise cause of the detention and names of all detained. Trust as champion of freedom, you will intercede on their behalf. Please wire collect. Nicholas Alienkov. On April the 11th, Coulter wired Alienkov, telegram received, writing you this afternoon. You should receive it tomorrow evening, R.M. Coulter. This telegram was sent by the Canadian Pacific Railway Telegram, but charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. Normally, a private business telegram would be charged to the recipient, and this was not official business. The follow-up Coulter letter to Alienkov is interesting because after confirming that the Trotsky Party was held at Amherst, it states that they were suspected of propaganda against the present Russian government and are supposed to be agents of Germany. Coulter adds then, they are not what they represent themselves to be. The Trotsky group is not detained by Canada, but by the imperial authorities. After assuring Alienkov that the detainees would be made comfortable, Coulter adds that any information in their favor would be transmitted to the military authorities. The general impression of the letter is that while Coulter is sympathetic and fully aware of Trotsky's pro-German links, he is unwilling to get involved. On April 11th, Arthur Wolfe of 134 East Broadway, New York, sent a telegram to Coulter. Though sent from New York, this telegram, after being acknowledged, was also charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. Coulter's reactions, however, reflect more than the detached sympathy evident in his letter to Alienkov. They must be considered in the light of the fact that these letters in behalf of Trotsky came from 2 American residents of New York City and involved the Canadian or imperial military matter of international importance. Further, Coulter, as Deputy Postmaster General, was a Canadian government official of some standing. Ponder for a moment what would happen to someone who similarly intervened in United States affairs. In the Trotsky affair, we have 2 American residents corresponding with a Canadian Deputy Postmaster General in order to intervene in behalf of an interned Russian revolutionary. Coulter's subsequent action also suggests something more than casual intervention. After Coulter acknowledged the Alienkov and Wolfe telegrams, he wrote to Major General Willoughby Gwatkin of the Department of Militia and Defense in Ottawa, a man of significant influence in the Canadian military, and attached copies of the Alienkov and Wolf telegrams. These men have been hostile to Russia because of the way the Jews have been treated and are now strongly in favor of the present administration. So far as I know, both are responsible men, both are reputable men, and I am sending their telegrams to you for what they may be worth, and so that you may represent them to the English authorities if you deem it wise. Obviously, Coulter knows, or intimates that he knows, a great deal about Alienkov and Wolf. His letter was in effect a character reference and aimed at the root of the internment problem, London. Gwatkin was well known in London and in fact was on loan to Canada from the War Office in London. Alienkov then sent a letter to Coulter to thank him. Most heartily for the interest you have taken in the fate of the Russian political exiles. You know me, esteemed Dr. Coulter, and you also know my devotion to the cause of Russian freedom. Happily, I know Mr. Trotsky, Mr. Melichinansky, and Mr. Chudnovsky intimately. It might be noted as an aside that if Alienkov knew Trotsky intimately, then he would also probably be aware that Trotsky had declared his intention to return to Russia to overthrow the provisional government and to institute the revolution. On receipt of Alienkov's letter, Coulter immediately, April 16th, forwarded it to Major General Gwatkin, adding that he became acquainted with Alienkov in connection with the department action on United States papers in the Russian language, and that Alienkov was working on the same lines as Mr. Wolf, who was an escaped prisoner from Siberia. Okay, let's see something here. Yeah, okay, interesting. Okay. Previously, on April the 14th, Gwatkin sent a memorandum to the naval counterpart of the Canadian Military Inter-Department Committee, repeating that the internees were Russian socialists with $10,000 subscribed by socialists and Germans. The concluding paragraph stated, on the other hand, there are those who declare that an act of high-handed injustice has been done. Then, on April the 16th, Vice Admiral C.E. Kingsmill, director of the Naval Service, took Gwatkin's intervention at face value. In a letter to Captain Mackins, the naval control officer at Halifax, he stated, the militia authorities request that a decision as to their, that is the 6 Russians, disposal may be hastened. A copy of this instruction was relayed to Gwatkin, who in turn informed Deputy Postmaster General Coulter. 3 days later, Gwatkin applied pressure. In a memorandum of April 20th to the Naval Secretary, he wrote, can you say please whether or not the Naval Control Office has given a decision? On the same day, April the 20th, Captain Mackins wrote Admiral Kingsmill explaining his reasons for removing Trotsky. He refused to be pressured into making a decision, stating, I will cable to the Admiralty informing them that the militia authorities are requesting an early decision as to their disposal. However, the next day, April the 21st, Gwatkin wrote Coulter, our friends, the Russian socialists, are to be released, and arrangements are being made for their passage to Europe. The order to make ends for Trotsky's release originated in the Admiralty, London. Coulter acknowledged the information, which will please our New York correspondents immensely. While we can, on the other hand, conclude that Coulter and Gwatkin were intensely interested in the release of Trotsky, we do not, on the other hand, know why. There was little in their career of their either Deputy Postmaster General Coulter or Major General Gwatkin that would explain an urge to release the Menshevik Leon Trotsky. Dr. Robert Miller Coulter was a medical doctor of Scottish and Irish parents, a liberal, a Freemason, and an Odd Fellow. He was appointed Deputy Postmaster General of Canada in 1897. His sole claim to fame derived from being a delegate to the Universal Postal Union Convention in 1906, and a delegate to the New Zealand and Australia in 1908, and for the All Red Project. All Red had nothing to do with Red Revolutionaries. It was only a plan for All Red or All British fast steamships between Great Britain, Canada, and Australia. Major General Willoughby Gwatkin stemmed from a long British military tradition, Cambridge and then the Staff College. Specialist in mobilization, he served in Canada from 1905 to 1918. Given only the documents in the Canadian files, we can but conclude that their intervention in behalf of Trotsky is a mystery. We can approach the Trotsky release from another angle. Canadian intelligence Lieutenant Colonel John Bain Maclean, a prominent Canadian publisher and businessman, founder and president of Maclean Publishing Company, Toronto, operated numerous Canadian trade journals, including the Financial Post. Maclean also had a long-time association with Canadian Army intelligence. In 1918, Colonel Maclean wrote for his own Maclean's magazine an article entitled, "Why Did We Let Trotsky Go? How Canada Lost an Opportunity to Shorten the War." The article contained detailed and unusual information about Leon Trotsky. Although the last half of the piece wanders off into space, remarking about barely related matters, we have two clues to the authenticity of the information. First, Colonel Maclean was a man of integrity with excellent connections in Canadian government intelligence. Second, government records since released by Canada, Great Britain, and the United States confirm Maclean's statement to a significant degree. Some Maclean's statements remain to be confirmed, but information available in the early 1970s is not necessarily inconsistent with Colonel Maclean's article. Maclean's opening argument is that some Canadian politicians or officials were chiefly responsible for the prolonging of the war, World War I, for the great loss of life, the wounds and sufferings of the winter of 1917, and the great dries of 1918. Further states Maclean, these persons were, in 1919, doing everything possible to prevent Parliament and the Canadian people from getting the related facts. Official reports, including those of Sir Douglas Haig, demonstrated that but for the Russian break in 1917, the war would have been over a year earlier, and that the man chiefly responsible for the defection of Russia was Trotsky, acting under German instructions. Who was Trotsky? According to Maclean, Trotsky was not a Russian, but German. Odd as this assertion may be, it does coincide with other scraps of intelligent information, to wit, that Trotsky spoke better German than Russian, and that he was the Russian executive of the German Black Bond. According to Maclean, Trotsky in August 1914 had been ostentatiously expelled from Berlin. He finally arrived in the United States, where he organized Russian revolutionaries as well as revolutionaries in Western Canada, who were largely Germans and Austrians traveling as Russians. Maclean states, originally, the British found, though Russian associates, that Kerensky, Lenin, and some lesser leaders were practically in German pay as early as 1950. And they uncovered in 1916 the connection with the Trotsky, then living in New York. From that time, he was closely watched by the bomb squad. In the early part of 1916, a German official sailed for New York. British intelligence officials accompanied him. He was held up at Halifax, but on their instruction, he was passed on with the profuse apologies for the necessary delay. After much maneuvering, he arrived in a dirty little newspaper office in the slums and found Trotsky, to whom he bore important instructions. From June 1916 until they passed him on to the British, the NY bomb squad never lost touch with Trotsky. They discovered that his real name was Braunstein and that he was German, not Russian. Such German activity in neutral countries is confirmed in State Department Report 316-9-764-9, describing organization of Russian refugees for revolutionary purposes. Continuing, Maclean states that Trotsky and four associates sailed on the SS Christiana and on April the 3rd reported to Captain Making and were taking off the ship at Halifax under the direction of Lieutenant Jones. Actually, a party of 9, including 6 men, were taken off the SS Christiana Ford. The name of the naval officer at Halifax was Captain O.M. Makins, R.N. The name of the officer who removed the Trotsky party from the ship is not in the Canadian government documents. Trotsky said it was a Machen. Again, according to Maclean, Trotsky's money came from German sources in New York. Also, generally the explanation given is that the release was done at the request of Kerensky, but months before the British officers and one Canadian serving in Russia who could speak the Russian language reported to London and Washington that Kerensky was in German service. Trotsky was released at the request of the British Embassy at Washington, which acted on the request of the U.S. State Department, who were acting for someone else. Canadian officials were instructed to inform the press that Trotsky was an American citizen traveling on an American passport, that his release was specially demanded by the Washington State Department. Moreover, writes Maclean, in Ottawa, Trotsky had and continues to have strong underground influence. There, his power was so great that orders were issued that he must be given every consideration. The theme of Maclean's reporting is quite evidently that Trotsky had immediate relations with and probably worked for the German general staff. While such relations have been established regarding Lenin, to the extent that Lenin was subsidized in his return to Russia facilitated by the Germans, it appears that Trotsky was similarly aided. The $10,000 Trotsky found in New York was from German sources, and a recently declassified document in the U.S. State Department files reads as follows. March 9, 1918, to American Consul of Vladivostok from Polk, Acting Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. For your confidential information and prompt attention, following is a substance of message of January the 12th from von Schanz of German Imperial Bank to Trotsky. Quote, Consent Imperial Bank, to appropriation from Credit General Staff of 5 million rubles for sending assistance to Chief Naval Officer Khrushchev to Far East. This message suggests some liaison between Trotsky and the Germans in January 1918, a time when Trotsky was proposing an alliance with the West. The State Department does not give the provenance of the telegram, only that it originated with the War College. The State Department did treat the message as authentic and acted on the basis of assumed authenticity. It is consistent with the general theme of Colonel McLean's article. Yeah, we can finish it up. We can finish up Trotsky. Consequently, we can derive the following sequence of events. Trotsky traveled from New York to Petrograd on a passport supplied by the intervention of Woodrow Wilson and with the declared intention to carry forward the revolution. The British government was the immediate source of Trotsky's release from Canadian custody in April 1917, but there may well have been pressures. Lincoln Steffens, an American communist, acted as a link between Wilson and Charles R. Crane and between Crane and Trotsky. Further, while Crane had no official position, his son Richard was confidential assistant to Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and Crane Sr. was provided with prompt and detailed reports on the progress of the Bolshevik Revolution. Moreover, Ambassador William Dodd, U.S. Ambassador to Germany in the Hitler era, said that Crane had an active role in the Kerensky phase of the revolution. The Steffens letter confirmed that Crane saw the Kerensky phase as only one step in a continuing revolution. The interesting point, however, is not so much the communication among dissimilar persons like Crane, Steffens, Trotsky, and Woodrow Wilson, as the existence of at least a few measures of agreement on the procedure to be followed. This is the provisional government was seen as provisional and the re-revolution was to follow. On either side of the coin, interpretation of Trotsky's intention should be cautious. He was adept at double games. Official documentation clearly demonstrates contradictory actions. For example, the divisions of the Far Eastern Affairs in the U.S. State Department received on March the 23rd, 1918, two reports stemming from Trotsky. One is inconsistent with the other. One report dated March 20th and from Moscow originated in the Russian newspaper Ruske Slovo. The report cited an interview with Trotsky in which he stated that an alliance with the United States was impossible. The Russia of the Soviet cannot align itself with capitalist America, for this would be a betrayal. It is impossible that America should seek such a rapprochement with us, driven by its antagonism towards Japan. But in any case, there can be no question of an alliance by us of any nature with a bourgeois nation. The other report, also originating in Moscow, was dated March 17, 1918, 3 days earlier, and from Ambassador Francis. Trotsky requests 5 American officers as inspectors of army being organized for defense, also requests railroad operating men and equipment. This request to the U.S. is, of course, inconsistent with rejection of an alliance. Before we leave Trotsky, some mention should be made of the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s, and in particular, the 1938 accusations and the trial of the anti-Soviet bloc of rightists and Trotskyites. These forced parodies of the judicial process, almost unanimously rejected in the West, may throw light on Trotsky's intentions. The crux of the Stalinist accusation was that Trotskyites were paid agents of international capitalism. G.K. Rakovsky, one of the 1938 defendants, said, or was induced to say, "We are the vanguard of foreign aggression of international fascism, and not only in the USSR, but also in Spain, China, throughout the world." The summation of the court contains the statement, "There is not a single man in the world who brought so much sorrow and misfortune to people as Trotsky. He is the vilest agent of fascism." Now, while this may be no more than verbal insults routinely traded among the international communists of the 1930s and 40s, it is also notable that the threads behind the self-accusation are consistent with the evidence in this chapter. And further, as we shall see later, Trotsky was able to generate support among international capitalists, who incidentally were also supporters of Mussolini and Hitler. So long as we see all international revolutionaries and all international capitalists as implacable enemies of one another, then we miss a crucial point. That there has indeed been some cooperation between international capitalists, including fascists, and there's no a priori reason why we should reject Trotsky as part of this alliance. This tentative, limited reassessment will be brought into sharp focus when we review the story of Michael Grusenberg, the chief Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia under the alias of Alexander Gumberg, was also confidential advisor to the Chase National Bank in New York and later to Floyd Odium of Atlas Corporation. This dual role was known to and accepted by both the Soviet and his American employers. The Grusenberg story is a case of history, international revolution allied with international capitalism. Colonel McLean's observation that Trotsky had strong underground influence and that his power was so great that orders were issued that he must be given every consideration are not at all inconsistent with Coulter Gwatkin's intervention in Trotsky's behalf, or, for that matter, with these later occurrences, the Stalinist accusations in the Trotsky show trials of the 1930s, nor are they inconsistent with the Grusenberg case. On the other hand, the only known direct link between Trotsky and international banking is through his cousin Abram Gevadvzo, who was a private banker in Kiev before the Russian Revolution and in Stockholm after the revolution. While Gevadvzo professed anti-Bolshevism, he was in fact acting on behalf of the Soviets in 1918 in currency transactions. Is it possible an international web can be spun from these events? First, there's Trotsky, a Russian internationalist revolutionary with German connections, who sparks assistance from two supposed supporters of Prince Lvov's government in Russia, Alienkov and Wolf, Russian residents in New York. These two ignite the action of a liberal Canadian deputy postmaster general, who in turn intercedes with a prominent British Army general on the Canadian military staff. These are all verifiable links. In brief, allegiances may not always be what they are called or appear. We can, however, surmise that Trotsky, Alienkov, Wolf, Coulter, and Gwatkin, in acting for common limited objectives, also had some common higher goal than national allegiance or political label. To emphasize, there is no absolute proof that this is so. It is also at this moment only logical supposition from the facts. A loyalty higher than that, forged by a common intermediate goal, need have been no more than that of friendship, although that strains the imagination when we ponder such a polyglot combination. It may also have been promoted by other motives. The picture is yet incomplete. This is the two main things I take away from this chapter. One, the claim that Woodrow Wilson helped Trotsky get a passport, and of course the Canadians let Trotsky go. But thirdly here, that Trotsky requested 5 American officials as inspectors of the army to organize the Red Army. That's crazy. And so this is from footnote 25. Wow. That is just crazy. Some of these footnotes have some interesting content here. We have Morris Hillquit had been a defense attorney for Johann Most after the assassination of President McKinley, and in 1917 was leader of the New York Socialist Party. In the 1920s, Hillquit established himself in the New York banking world by becoming a director of and attorney for the International Union Bank. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Hillquit helped draw up the NRA codes for the garment industry. Gwatkin's memoranda and the Canadian government files are not signed, but initialed with the cryptic marker symbol. The mark has been identified as Gwatkin's because of one Gwatkin letter, that of April the 21st, was that cryptic mark was acknowledged. According to his own account, Trotsky did not arrive in the U.S. until January 1917. Trotsky's real name was Bronstein. He invented the name Trotsky. Bronstein is German and Trotsky is Polish rather than Russian. His first name is usually given as Leon. However, Trotsky's first book, which was published in Geneva, has the initial N, not L. Okay, so we'll start chapter 3 next week. Let's see what we have in the chat. Lots of comments in the chat today. Cyber Ninja Zero, one could argue this was a case of pure geopolitical interest on both sides. Yeah, I mean, we have this with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? Why would Hitler and Stalin ally? Strange bedfellows can be made, so that's true. AF, hello. Let's see. All right, everyone. So that's tonight. We got to chapter 1 and 2, and we will continue next week. Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.